The morning mist clung to the Cascade Mountains like a burial shroud, as Dennis Kowalski carefully folded his worn canvas sleeping bag and secured it to the bottom of his army surplus backpack. It was September 15th, 1973, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Outside his cramped one-bedroom apartment on Blair Boulevard in Eugene, Oregon, Dennis could hear the distant rumble of logging trucks heading toward the mills that kept this college town's economy alive. At 34, Dennis still moved with the careful precision of a soldier, though the war in Vietnam had ended for him 2 years earlier. His hands, scarred from shrapnel that had torn through his radio equipment during the Tet Offensive, worked methodically as he checked each item in his pack. Water purification tablets, compass, first aid kit, matches sealed in waterproof containers, and most importantly, the hand-drawn topographical map he'd been perfecting for the past 6 months. Every creek, every ridge, every game trail in the McKenzie Pass area was meticulously documented in his small, precise handwriting. His younger sister Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, cradling a steaming mug of Folgers coffee between her palms. At 29, she had their mother's worried eyes and their father's stubborn jawline. She'd learned not to argue with Dennis about his solo camping trips. They were the only thing that seemed to quiet the nightmares that still woke him most nights, leaving him drenched in sweat and calling out names of men who would never answer again. "You sure you don't want company, Denny?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Tom could take a few days off from the mill. You know how much he enjoys getting out into the woods." Her husband worked the graveyard shift at Weyerhuser, and she could see the exhaustion in his face every morning when he came home covered in sawdust and smelling of pine resin. Dennis shook his head, checking his compass one last time before tucking it into his shirt pocket alongside the map. The compass had been a gift from his squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, who died 3 weeks before Dennis's tour ended. "This is something I need to do alone, Maggie. The mountains don't ask questions, and they don't expect answers. They just listen." Before we continue with Dennis's story, we'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us continue bringing you these compelling true stories that deserve to be told. Margaret had every reason to worry about her brother. The man who had left Eugene as a confident 19-year-old high school football star had returned from Southeast Asia as a stranger. The Dennis who came back was quieter, more cautious, prone to long silences that could stretch for hours. He'd jumped from job to job since his discharge, warehouse work, construction, even a brief stint as a night security guard. But nothing seemed to hold his interest for long. The only constant was his obsession with the Oregon wilderness, particularly the remote areas around McKenzie Pass, where few other hikers ventured. "I mapped enemy positions for 2 years, he'd told her once during one of his rare moments of openness about the war. "Drew every bunker, every tunnel, every safe route through the jungle. At least here, I'm mapping something beautiful instead of something that's trying to kill me." Dennis had started exploring the Cascade wilderness during his first month back home, initially taking day hikes to escape the crowds and noise of Eugene. But as the months passed, his trips grew longer and more ambitious. He'd discovered hidden lakes that didn't appear on any official maps, ancient Native American trails that wound through old-growth forests, and most intriguingly, a network of lava tubes and caves formed during the region's volcanic past. "I'll be back Sunday evening," Dennis promised, shouldering his pack with practiced ease. The weight distribution was perfect, 42 pounds including 3 days of food, water, and emergency supplies. Just 3 days up near Proxy Falls. Nothing I haven't done a dozen times before. He climbed into his faded blue 1968 Ford F-100 pickup truck, the one he'd bought used from a dealer in Springfield with his mustering out pay. The engine coughed and wheezed before catching, a familiar ritual that required patience and a gentle touch on the accelerator. Margaret stood on the front porch of the duplex she shared with Tom, watching as her brother backed out of the gravel driveway. The morning sun caught the rear window of the Ford as it turned onto Blair Boulevard, and Margaret felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the September air. She told herself it was just her usual worry, the same feeling she got every time Dennis disappeared into the wilderness for days at a time. But something felt different this time, though she couldn't put her finger on what. Dennis drove east through Eugene's quiet residential neighborhoods, past the University of Oregon campus where early rising students were already heading to classes. The radio crackled with news about the ongoing Watergate hearings. President Nixon was facing increasing pressure to resign, and the country seemed to be tearing itself apart over Vietnam, civil rights, and a dozen other issues that made Dennis grateful for the simplicity of the mountains. He turned off the radio as he reached Highway 126, preferring the sound of wind rushing through his partially open windows and the steady rumble of the Ford's inline-six engine. The road wound eastward through the Willamette National Forest, climbing steadily toward the Cascade Range. Dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock pressed close to the asphalt, their branches creating a green tunnel that filtered the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. At the small town of Blue River, Dennis stopped for gas and a final check of his supplies. The teenager working the Texaco station was friendly but incurious, more interested in the music playing on his transistor radio than in another lone camper heading into the mountains. Dennis bought a candy bar and a copy of the Eugene Register Guard, scanning the headlines while the boy filled his tank. More Vietnam casualties, more protest marches, more politicians making promises they probably couldn't keep. The last 30 miles to his chosen camping area took him through increasingly remote country. Traffic thinned to an occasional logging truck or Forest Service vehicle, and the radio stations faded to static as he climbed higher into the mountains. Dennis had selected this particular area after months of study, choosing a spot that offered both solitude and access to the cave system he was determined to explore and map. By late afternoon, Dennis had reached the end of the maintained road and transferred his gear to his back for the final 2-mile hike to his chosen campsite. The trail was little more than a deer path, winding through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs that testified to the previous winter's storms. He moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of an experienced backpacker, pausing occasionally to update his map with new landmarks or to photograph interesting geological formations with his battered Kodak Instamatic camera. The campsite he'd selected was a small meadow beside a seasonal creek, sheltered by towering pines and hidden from any established trail. Dennis had camped here twice before and knew it offered fresh water, level ground for his tent, and most importantly, complete privacy. He could go days without seeing another human being, which was exactly what he needed. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Dennis methodically established his camp. His army surplus pup tent went up with military precision, stakes driven at exact angles and guy ropes tensioned to perfection. He gathered enough deadfall for a small cooking fire, arranged his gear for easy access during the night, and prepared a simple dinner of canned beef stew and instant coffee. Sitting beside his small fire as darkness settled over the mountains, Dennis spread his map across his knees and studied it by the dancing light of the flames. Tomorrow, he planned to explore a series of caves he'd discovered during his previous trips to the area. The lava tubes appeared to form an extensive network, possibly connecting several valleys in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the surface. His military training had taught him the value of understanding terrain in 3 dimensions, and these underground passages represented a fascinating puzzle that had captured his imagination. Dennis had already mapped the entrances to 6 different caves, noting their approximate depths and the presence of multiple chambers. But there was one cave system in particular that had drawn his attention, a large opening hidden behind a rock fall that seemed to drop much deeper than the others. On his last visit, time constraints had prevented him from fully exploring it, but he'd made careful notes about its location and characteristics. As he sat by the dying fire, updating his journal with observations about weather conditions and wildlife signs, Dennis felt the familiar sense of peace that only came to him in the wilderness. Here, surrounded by the ancient rhythms of forest and stone, the ghosts of Vietnam seemed less real, less pressing. The nightmares still came, but not as often, and when they did, he could step outside his tent and remind himself that he was no longer in a jungle where every shadow might conceal an enemy. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always did in the mountains after sunset, and Dennis banked his fire before retreating to his tent. He fell asleep to the sound of wind sighing through the pines and the distant call of a great horned owl, unaware that this would be the last peaceful night he would ever know. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with frost coating the meadow grass and ice forming along the edges of the creek. Dennis woke before sunrise, a habit ingrained by 2 years of military routine, and had coffee brewing before full daylight penetrated the forest canopy. He ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and dried fruit, studying his map one final time before packing his day hiking gear. For this exploration, Dennis traveled light, a small backpack containing water, emergency food, first aid supplies, flashlight, spare batteries, rope, and his precious map. He also carried a camera to document anything interesting he might discover, and a small notebook for recording detailed observations. Most importantly, he had his compass and the unwavering confidence of a man who had survived far more dangerous terrain than anything the Oregon Cascades could offer. The hike to the cave system took him across 2 ridges and down into a narrow valley that rarely saw sunlight even at midday. The vegetation here was different, more primitive somehow, with ancient ferns and moss-covered rocks that spoke of geological time measured in millennia rather than human years. Dennis moved carefully, constantly checking his position against known landmarks and updating his map with new details. He found the cave entrance exactly where his notes indicated it would be, a roughly circular opening, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, partially concealed by fallen boulders and the gnarled roots of an ancient cedar tree. Previous rainfall had washed away most traces of his earlier visits, but Dennis could still see faint scuff marks on the rocks where he'd tested handholds during his initial descent. Before entering the cave, Dennis followed the safety protocols he'd established for all his solo explorations. He left a detailed note on the surface describing his plans, secured to a tree with waterproof tape. He checked his flashlight batteries, tested his rope, and made a final entry in his journal, noting the time of his descent and his estimated return to the surface. The first chamber of the cave system was much as Dennis remembered it, a natural room, perhaps 20 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above his flashlight beam. But it was the passage leading deeper into the mountain that had captured his attention during his previous visit. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, disappearing into complete darkness that his light couldn't penetrate. Dennis had learned patience in the military, and he took his time exploring the cave's upper levels before attempting the more challenging descent. He photographed rock formations that might help other explorers navigate the system, made detailed sketches of each chamber's layout, and carefully noted the presence of underground water sources. Everything was methodically documented in his precise handwriting, creating a record that would be invaluable to future visitors. It was nearly noon when Dennis finally began his descent into the lower levels of the cave system. The passage was narrower here, requiring him to move carefully to avoid scraping against the sharp volcanic rock. His flashlight beam revealed a tunnel that seemed to continue downward, much farther than he had expected, opening occasionally into larger chambers before narrowing again. As he descended, Dennis began to notice things that made his soldier's instincts prickle with unease. There were marks on the cave walls that didn't look natural, scratches and scrapes that suggested human passage, but older than his own previous visits. More disturbing were the occasional pieces of debris he found lodged in cracks in the rock. Fragments of cloth, a corroded metal button, what looked like part of a leather shoe sole. When Dennis finally reached the main chamber, 50 feet below the cave entrance, his flashlight revealed something that made his blood run cold. This was no natural cave formation. The chamber had been used by humans, possibly for years or even decades. Along the walls, partially concealed by rockfalls and debris, were clear signs of human presence and human death. Dennis had seen enough battlefield casualties to recognize human remains when he encountered them, but these weren't the remains of lost hikers or accident victims. The positioning of the bones, the condition of the clothing fragments, and most disturbing of all, the presence of obviously child-sized remains suggested something far more sinister. This wasn't a place where people had died by accident. This was a place where they had been brought to die. With hands that shook despite his military training, Dennis began to document everything he saw. His camera flash illuminated scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his brief remaining life. Children's clothing, small shoes, personal items that spoke of young lives cut short, and in the deeper recesses of the chamber, evidence that suggested this killing ground had been used repeatedly over a period of years. Dennis's training took over as he methodically photographed and sketched the chamber's contents. He recognized the importance of preserving evidence, of creating a record that could be used by authorities to identify victims and potentially catch whoever was responsible for these horrors. But even as he worked, he was painfully aware of his vulnerability. If the person or persons responsible for this carnage were still active in the area, his presence in the cave represented a mortal threat to their security. As he prepared to leave the chamber and return to the surface, Dennis made detailed notes about everything he had observed. In his small, careful handwriting, he recorded the location of remains, described clothing and personal effects, and noted evidence that suggested recent activity in the chamber. His final entry was prophetic in its urgency. Evidence of multiple homicides, including children. Recent activity suggests perpetrator may still be active. Must contact authorities immediately upon return to Eugene. But Dennis Kowalski would never make that return journey to Eugene. Even as he carefully packed his camera and notes, preparing for the difficult climb back to the surface, he was being watched by someone who could not afford to let him leave the mountain alive. The discovery of Dennis's terrible secret would have to wait 35 years for another visitor to this remote valley. And when that discovery finally came, it would reveal a horror that stretched back decades and claimed victims whose names had been forgotten by everyone, except the families who still mourned their disappearance. The meticulous map that Dennis had created with such care would become the key to unlocking one of Oregon's most disturbing criminal cases, though the man who had drawn it would never know the vital role his work would play in bringing justice to the forgotten dead. The first sign that something was wrong came on Sunday evening, September 17, 1973, when Dennis failed to return to Eugene as he had promised his sister Margaret. She had spent the day in a state of increasing anxiety, though she couldn't pinpoint the source of her unease. Tom had tried to reassure her throughout the afternoon, reminding her that Dennis had occasionally extended his camping trips when the weather was particularly favorable, or when he'd discovered something interesting to explore. "He's probably just found another cave to map," Tom said, as they sat on their front porch, watching the sun set behind the hills west of Eugene. "You know how he gets when he's working on one of his projects. Time just disappears for him out there." But Margaret's intuition, sharpened by years of worrying about her brother's well-being, told her this time was different. Dennis had been unusually specific about his return date, even mentioning that he wanted to be back in time to watch the Sunday night movie on television. More importantly, he had never failed to keep a promise to her, not once since his return from Vietnam. By Monday morning, Margaret's worry had transformed into genuine alarm. She called the sawmill to tell them Tom wouldn't be coming to work, then drove out to Dennis's apartment to see if he might have returned during the night without calling. His landlord, Mr. Henderson, let her into the small apartment, where everything was exactly as Dennis had left it on Friday morning. His bed was made with military precision, his few dishes were clean and neatly stacked, and there was no sign that he had been home. Margaret spent Monday afternoon calling everyone she could think of who might have seen Dennis, his former co-workers, the few friends he had maintained contact with, even the managers at outdoor equipment stores where he occasionally shopped for camping supplies. No one had seen him since Friday, and several people mentioned that Dennis was almost fanatically punctual about keeping appointments and commitments. By Tuesday morning, Margaret could no longer ignore the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to her brother. She drove to the Lane County Sheriff's Department, located in a solid brick building on 5th Avenue in downtown Eugene, and asked to speak to someone about filing a missing person report. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and grey hair, listened patiently as Margaret explained the situation. "Ma'am, I understand your concern," Sergeant Williams said gently, "but we generally wait at least 72 hours before we consider an adult officially missing. Your brother's an experienced outdoorsman, and it's not uncommon for hikers to extend their trips, especially when the weather's good." Margaret's frustration boiled over. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "My brother came back from Vietnam with problems, but being unreliable isn't one of them. If Dennis said he'd be home Sunday evening, then something prevented him from keeping that promise. Something serious." The sergeant's expression softened as he recognized the genuine distress in Margaret's voice. He'd seen enough grieving families during his 20 years with the department to recognize when someone's fear was based on solid intuition rather than simple worry. "Tell me about his camping plans," he said, pulling out an incident report form. "Where exactly was he going, and what kind of equipment did he have with him?" Margaret provided every detail she could remember about Dennis's departure: the location near Proxy Falls, his blue Ford pickup, the equipment he'd packed, even the clothes he'd been wearing. She also gave the sergeant a detailed description of her brother's physical appearance and background, including his military service and his extensive experience in the Oregon wilderness. "One more thing," Margaret added, as Sergeant Williams finished writing his report. "Dennis has been working on detailed maps of the area where he goes camping. If something happened to him, those maps might help you find him. He keeps them in a plastic bag with his other papers." Deputy Ray Morrison, a lean man in his 40s who knew the McKenzie Pass area better than almost anyone in the department, caught the case when Sergeant Williams passed along Margaret's report. Morrison had grown up hunting and fishing in the Cascade Mountains, and he understood both the allure and the dangers of the remote wilderness areas that attracted experienced outdoorsmen like Dennis Kowalski. Morrison's first step was to organize a preliminary search of the area Margaret had described. On Wednesday morning, September 19th, he drove up Highway 126 with 2 other deputies and a volunteer from the local search and rescue team. The weather was still clear and mild, with excellent visibility and no immediate threat of storms that might complicate search efforts. They found Dennis's campsite exactly where Margaret had said it would be. and Morrison's experienced eye immediately recognized that something was amiss. The camp was too neat, too undisturbed for someone who had been living there for 3 days. Dennis's tent was still standing, with his sleeping bag rolled up inside, but there were no signs of recent use. No coffee grounds in the fire ring, no food scraps, no indication that anyone had slept there since Friday night. Most telling was the condition of Dennis's Ford pickup. The blue truck was parked exactly where he had left it, with the keys still in the ignition and his spare clothes still folded in a duffel bag behind the seat. Morrison found Dennis's shaving kit and toiletries untouched, suggesting that he had planned to return to camp Saturday evening, but had never made it back from his day hike. "This doesn't look like someone who got lost or decided to extend his trip," Morrison told his partner, Deputy Sarah Chen, as they examined the campsite. "This looks like someone who left for a day hike and never came back. The question is whether we're dealing with an accident, medical emergency, or something else entirely." The preliminary search focused on the established trails and known hazards within a 5-mile radius of Dennis's camp. The search team called Dennis's name repeatedly, their voices echoing off the surrounding ridges and canyon walls. They checked every steep drop-off, every creek crossing, every location where an experienced hiker might suffer an accident that would prevent him from returning to camp. By Thursday afternoon, it was clear that the initial search had failed to locate any trace of Dennis beyond his abandoned campsite. Morrison expanded the search to include volunteer teams from Eugene and Springfield, coordinating with the U.S. Forest Service to access detailed topographical maps of the region. Local newspapers picked up the story, describing Dennis as an experienced outdoorsman and Vietnam veteran who had vanished without a trace in familiar territory. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a geology professor at the University of Oregon who had been studying the volcanic cave systems throughout the Cascade Range, volunteered her expertise when she read about Dennis's disappearance in the Eugene Register Guard. She contacted Deputy Morrison to offer her knowledge of the area's underground features, which she believed might not be adequately represented on standard hiking maps. The McKenzie Pass area contains one of the most extensive networks of lava tubes and volcanic caves in Oregon, Dr. Hartwell explained during a meeting at the Sheriff's Department on Friday morning. Most of these features formed during volcanic activity thousands of years ago, and many have never been properly surveyed or mapped. An experienced explorer might be tempted to investigate these caves, but they can be extremely dangerous. Unstable ceilings, hidden drop-offs, toxic gases in poorly ventilated areas. Morrison was particularly interested in Dr. Hartwell's suggestion that Dennis might have been exploring unmapped cave systems. Margaret had mentioned her brother's fascination with underground features, and Morrison had noticed camping equipment missing from Dennis's site that would be useful for cave exploration: rope, extra flashlight batteries, and a small camera for documentation. The expanded search effort included teams of volunteers with cave rescue experience, equipped with specialized lighting and safety equipment. Dr. Hartwell provided locations of known cave entrances within Dennis's probable hiking range, and the search teams methodically explored each system they could safely access. But the work was slow and dangerous, requiring expert knowledge to avoid cave-ins and other hazards that could trap the rescuers themselves. As days turned into weeks, the intensive search effort gradually scaled back to periodic sweeps by volunteers and family members. The official investigation remained active, but Deputy Morrison was forced to acknowledge that they had found no concrete evidence of Dennis's fate. He could have fallen into an unmapped cave system, suffered a medical emergency in a location too remote for his body to be easily discovered, or encountered any number of hazards that could claim the life of even an experienced outdoorsman. Margaret refused to accept that her brother had simply vanished without a trace. Every weekend, she drove to the McKenzie Pass area with Tom and a handful of volunteers, continuing the search long after the official effort had been suspended. She posted flyers with Dennis's photograph throughout Central Oregon, hoping someone might have seen him or could provide information about his whereabouts. The emotional toll of her brother's disappearance was enormous. Margaret found herself unable to concentrate at her job as a bookkeeper for a local insurance agency, jumping every time the phone rang in hope that it might be news about Dennis. She lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and struggled with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether her brother was dead or alive, suffering somewhere or at peace. Tom watched his wife's anguish with growing concern, but he understood that Margaret needed to feel she was doing everything possible to find her brother. He took vacation time from the sawmill to help with search efforts, organized fundraising drives to support the volunteer searches, and gradually assumed more and more of the household responsibilities as Margaret's grief consumed her energy and attention. The case received sporadic coverage in local newspapers throughout the fall and winter of 1973. But public interest gradually faded as no new developments emerged. Dennis Kowalski became another statistic in the long list of people who disappeared in the Oregon wilderness each year, some eventually found alive, some found dead, and some never found at all. Deputy Morrison kept the case file active and continued to follow up on occasional tips and reported sightings, but none led to concrete evidence of Dennis's whereabouts. The deputy's own theory was that Dennis had fallen into a deep cave system where his body would be extremely difficult to recover, but without more specific information about his intended route, even that possibility couldn't be confirmed. As 1974 began, Margaret made a difficult decision to box up most of Dennis's belongings and put them in storage, keeping only his most personal items and the maps he had been working on. She couldn't bring herself to dispose of his things entirely, but living with constant reminders of her missing brother was becoming unbearable. The maps, in particular, became both a source of hope and torment for Margaret. She studied them obsessively, trying to decipher Dennis's notations and symbols, hoping to find some clue that might lead to his location. But the detailed topographical information was beyond her understanding, and the maps seemed to raise more questions than they answered. Years passed slowly for Margaret and Tom, marked by birthdays and anniversaries that Dennis would never celebrate, by holidays that felt incomplete without his presence. Margaret gradually returned to a semblance of normal life, but she never stopped hoping that someday she would learn what had happened to her brother during that September weekend in 1973. The Vietnam War ended officially in 1975, and Margaret thought often about how Dennis had survived that conflict only to vanish in the peaceful mountains he loved. She wondered if his wartime experiences had somehow contributed to his disappearance, whether the psychological wounds he carried had led him to take risks he wouldn't have considered before his military service. In 1978, Margaret and Tom were blessed with the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Linda. As Margaret held her newborn baby, she thought about how Dennis would have been such a devoted uncle, how he would have taught Linda to appreciate the natural world that had given him so much peace. The joy of becoming a mother was tempered by the ongoing sadness of Dennis's absence from all the important moments of their family's life. 2 more children followed, Thomas Jr. in 1981 and Sarah in 1984, and Margaret gradually built a full and meaningful life around her growing family. But she never stopped visiting Dennis's storage unit once a year on the anniversary of his disappearance to touch his belongings and remember the brother who had meant so much to her. The children grew up hearing stories about their missing Uncle Dennis, the war hero who had loved the mountains and had disappeared while exploring the wilderness he knew so well. Margaret was careful to present Dennis as a positive figure in their family history, emphasizing his courage, his kindness, and his love of adventure, rather than dwelling on the mystery of his fate. As the years turned into decades, advances in search and rescue technology offered occasional hope that Dennis's remains might eventually be discovered. Ground-penetrating radar, GPS navigation systems, and improved cave rescue techniques all made it theoretically possible to locate bodies in places that had been inaccessible during the 1970s. But the Cascade Mountains encompass thousands of square miles of wilderness, and without more specific information about Dennis's final destination, even modern technology couldn't narrow the search area sufficiently. Deputy Morrison retired in 1995 after more than 30 years with the Lane County Sheriff's Department. Dennis Kowalski's disappearance remained one of the unsolved cases that haunted him throughout his career, and he continued to think about the missing veteran long after he turned in his badge. Morrison's successor, Detective Janet Foster, inherited the cold case files, but had little new information to work with. By the early 2000s, Margaret was approaching retirement age herself. Her children were grown and starting families of their own, and Dennis's disappearance had become a permanent part of the family's history rather than an active source of daily grief. She had learned to live with the uncertainty, though she never stopped hoping for answers. It was the death of Margaret's husband Tom in 2007, following a brief battle with lung cancer, likely caused by decades of exposure to sawmill chemicals, that finally prompted her to begin the difficult process of sorting through the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. Among the boxes stored in their garage were Dennis's belongings, untouched for over 30 years, except for her annual visits to remember her brother. Margaret was 67 years old when she finally opened the plastic storage bag containing Dennis's maps and papers, prepared to face whatever memories and emotions they might trigger. She had avoided examining them closely for decades, partly because they were too painful and partly because she lacked the technical knowledge to fully understand their significance. But time and grief had given Margaret a different perspective on her brother's obsessive documentation of the McKenzie Pass area. As she spread the largest map across her kitchen table on a quiet Saturday morning in March 2008, she began to notice details that she had missed during her earlier, emotion-clouded examinations. Dennis's handwriting was as precise and careful as she remembered, with every topographical feature meticulously recorded and cross-referenced to compass bearings and elevation measurements. The map showed far more detail than any commercial hiking map of the area, with numerous caves, springs, and geological features marked in Dennis's characteristic symbols and abbreviations. It was in the lower right corner of the map, in an area marked with several cave symbols and detailed elevation notes, that Margaret discovered something that made her hands tremble with a mixture of hope and dread. In handwriting that was definitely Dennis's, but somehow more urgent and less controlled than his usual careful lettering, were notes that changed everything she thought she knew about her brother's disappearance. Large chamber system, 50+ feet below surface, the notes read. Evidence of extended human presence. Recent activity suggested by condition of materials found. Children's clothing and personal effects recovered from multiple locations within cave. Ages estimated 6 to 14 years. Condition suggests violent deaths, not accidental. Additional adult remains partially concealed in deeper chambers. Margaret's vision blurred as she read and reread her brother's final observations. Below these notes, in even smaller handwriting that looked like it had been added hastily, possibly by different lighting conditions, were the words that explained everything. Recent bone fragments suggest continued activity. Perpetrator may still be using sight. Extreme danger. Must contact authorities immediately upon return to Eugene. Evidence photographed and documented. Camera contains proof. The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. Dennis hadn't simply fallen into a cave or suffered an accident during his exploration. He had stumbled upon evidence of multiple murders, possibly spanning years or decades. And if the perpetrator had still been active in the area in September 1973, Dennis's discovery of the crime scene would have represented a mortal threat to someone who had managed to kill repeatedly without detection. Margaret's hand shook as she carefully examined every inch of the map, looking for additional clues that might help locate the cave system Dennis had described. His notations included compass bearings, estimated distances from known landmarks, and even rough sketches of the cave entrance's appearance. Everything needed to find the location was there, preserved in her brother's meticulous documentation. With a clarity born of 35 years of grief and uncertainty, Margaret finally understood what had happened to Dennis Kowalski in September 1973. He had gone into the mountains as an explorer and inadvertently became a detective, uncovering evidence of crimes that someone had been desperate to keep hidden. His disappearance wasn't a hiking accident or a case of getting lost in familiar territory. It was murder, committed to silence a witness who had seen too much. The next morning, Sunday, March 23, 2008, Margaret drove to the Lane County Sheriff's Department with Dennis's map, carefully protected in the same plastic bag where it had rested for 35 years. The building had been renovated and expanded since her last visit in the 1970s, but the basic mission remained the same: to serve and protect the citizens of Lane County, including those who had been victims of crimes decades earlier. Detective Maria Santos, a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in cold cases and had built a reputation for tenacious investigation of seemingly hopeless cases, met with Margaret in a small conference room lined with filing cabinets and bulletin boards covered with photographs and evidence reports. Detective Santos had read about the Kowalski disappearance in the old case files, but she had never worked the investigation personally. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Santos said, using Margaret's married name, "I want you to know that this case has never been closed. We've been waiting 35 years for new information, and if this map contains what you think it does, it could change everything." Margaret spread Dennis's map across the conference table and pointed to the notes that had shaken her so deeply. Detective Santos examined the handwriting with a magnifying glass, comparing it to samples from Dennis's military records and other documents in the case file. There was no question that the notes were authentic, written in Dennis's distinctive hand. "This suggests your brother discovered a crime scene," Detective Santos said carefully. "If these notes are accurate, we're potentially looking at evidence of multiple homicides spanning an extended period of time. The question is whether we can locate this cave system after 35 years and whether any physical evidence might still exist." The detective explained that advances in forensic science had made it possible to recover and analyze evidence from crime scenes decades old, particularly in environments like caves where decomposition might be slowed by stable temperatures and limited exposure to weather. DNA analysis, improved photography techniques, and modern excavation methods all offered hope that Dennis's discovery might finally lead to justice for victims whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the families who still mourned their disappearance. Detective Santos contacted Dr. Robert Chen, the geologist who had taken over Dr. Hartwell's research after her retirement, to help interpret Dennis's topographical notations and locate the cave system he had documented. Dr. Chen was fascinated by the map's accuracy and detail, noting that Dennis had been far ahead of his time in his systematic approach to cave exploration and documentation. "Your brother was essentially doing the work of a professional speleologist," Dr. Chen told Margaret during their first meeting. His measurements are precise enough that I should be able to locate this cave system within a relatively small search area. The real question is whether the entrance is still accessible after 35 years of rockfalls and vegetation growth. The investigation that followed Margaret's discovery would become one of the most complex and emotionally challenging cases in Lane County's history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies, forensic experts, and search teams equipped with the most advanced technology available. But it all began with one woman's decision to finally examine her brother's legacy and her courage to face the terrible truth his careful documentation had preserved. The search for Dennis Kowalski's cave would reveal horrors that had been hidden in the Oregon mountains for decades, and it would finally provide answers not just for Margaret and her family, but for other families who had never known what happened to their missing children during the dark years when a killer stalked the remote areas of the Cascade Range. Detective Santos assembled her task force on April 1, 2008, bringing together expertise from multiple agencies and disciplines. The Lane County Sheriff's Department provided the primary investigative team, while the Oregon State Police contributed specialized search and rescue personnel experienced in cave exploration. The FBI became involved due to the potential for multiple homicides crossing jurisdictional boundaries, and they brought advanced forensic capabilities that would be essential for processing a crime scene that had been undisturbed for over 3 decades. Dr. Robert Chen spent the first week studying Dennis's map in detail, cross-referencing his notations with modern geological surveys and satellite imagery of the McKenzie Pass area. The accuracy of Dennis's work made Chen's job easier than it might have been, but 35 years of natural changes to the landscape meant that surface landmarks might have shifted or disappeared entirely. The good news is that your brother documented multiple reference points for the cave location, Dr. Chen explained to Margaret during a briefing at the Sheriff's Department. He used triangulation techniques that should allow us to pinpoint the area within a few hundred yards. The challenging part will be finding an entrance that may have been intentionally concealed or naturally blocked by rockfalls over the decades. The search team established a base camp in the same general area where Dennis had camped in September 1973. Modern GPS technology allowed them to locate his exact campsite, which had long since been reclaimed by forest undergrowth. The team included specialists in cave rescue, forensic archaeology, and crime scene processing, all working under the coordination of Detective Santos and FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres. Ground-penetrating radar equipment, unavailable during the original search for Dennis, was brought in to scan the areas identified by his map as potential cave locations. The radar could detect underground voids and cavities that might indicate cave systems, even when surface entrances were blocked or hidden. On April 8th, the radar team identified a significant underground void in an area that matched Dennis's map coordinates exactly. The location was a narrow valley between 2 ridges, heavily forested and showing no obvious signs of human activity. But when the team began clearing vegetation and examining rock formations more closely, they found what they were looking for. The cave entrance was exactly as Dennis had described it. A roughly circular opening partially concealed by fallen boulders and the root system of a large cedar tree, but 35 years of natural processes had nearly sealed the entrance, requiring careful excavation to create an opening large enough for modern cave rescue equipment. Cave rescue specialist Jake Morrison, a third-generation member of a family that had been involved in Oregon's search and rescue for over 50 years, was the first person to enter the cave system since Dennis's fatal exploration in 1973. Morrison carried modern LED lighting systems, digital cameras, and communications equipment that allowed the surface team to monitor his progress and safety throughout the descent. The upper levels of the cave were much as Dennis had described them, natural lava tube formations with multiple chambers and passages leading deeper into the mountain. But it was when Morrison reached the main chamber, approximately 50 feet below the surface, that the full horror of Dennis's discovery was finally revealed. "I'm in the main chamber now," Morrison reported through his radio headset, his voice tight with professional control. "I can confirm the presence of human remains, multiple individuals, in locations consistent with the missing persons map notations. This is definitely a crime scene, and it's extensive." The forensic team spent the next 3 days establishing proper access to the cave system and securing the scene for detailed investigation. The work was painstaking and emotionally difficult as it became clear that Dennis had discovered a killing ground that had been used repeatedly over a period of years, or possibly decades. Dr. Angela Foster, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, descended into the cave on the 4th day to begin the careful process of documenting and recovering human remains. Her initial assessment confirmed Dennis's observations: multiple victims, including several children, with evidence suggesting violent deaths rather than accidental deaths or natural causes. "This appears to be a disposal site that was used systematically over an extended period," Dr. Foster reported to Detective Santos. "The condition and positioning of the remains suggests they were brought here after death, not that deaths occurred at this location. We're looking at evidence of serial homicides, possibly spanning decades." Among the remains recovered from the cave were those of Dennis Kowalski himself, found in a smaller side chamber along with his day hiking equipment. The condition of his remains and their location suggested that he had been killed shortly after discovering the other victims, his body concealed in an attempt to hide evidence of his murder. Most heartbreaking was the recovery of Dennis's camera, still containing the film he had used to document his terrible discovery. When the film was carefully processed using modern techniques designed for severely aged materials, it revealed images that provided crucial evidence for identifying victims and understanding the scope of the crimes. The photographs showed exactly what Dennis's notes had described: children's clothing, personal effects, and remains that spoke of young lives cut short. But they also showed something else that would prove crucial to the investigation: evidence of the killer's identity, preserved for 35 years in the darkness of the cave. Among the personal effects Dennis had photographed was a distinctive belt buckle with the logo of a Pacific Northwest logging company. The buckle was unusual enough that it could potentially be traced to specific employees, providing the first concrete lead toward identifying the person responsible for decades of murder. Detective Santos coordinated with logging company records from the 1960s and 1970s, focusing on employees who had worked in the areas where children had disappeared during those years. The investigation revealed a pattern of missing children cases that had never been connected, because they occurred in different jurisdictions and were separated by months or years. Carl Brennan emerged as the primary suspect after Detective Santos discovered that he had worked for multiple logging operations throughout Central Oregon during the period when children began disappearing. Brennan had been a transient worker, moving from camp to camp and town to town, never staying long enough to become well known to local residents or law enforcement. But Carl Brennan had died in a logging accident in 1978, 5 years after Dennis's disappearance, taking his secrets to the grave and leaving behind only the evidence that Dennis had risked his life to preserve. The investigation could finally provide answers to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their missing children, but it could not bring the perpetrator to justice. The dental records and DNA analysis allowed forensic experts to identify most of the victims found in the cave, matching them to missing person cases that stretched back to the early 1960s. Each identification brought closure to a family that had never known what happened to their child, but it also revealed the true scope of Brennan's crimes. Margaret attended the memorial service for her brother on October 15, 2008, exactly 35 years and 1 month after Dennis had disappeared while trying to document evidence that would eventually lead to this moment. The service was also a memorial for the 8 children whose remains had been found alongside Dennis, their families finally able to lay their loved ones to rest. Sheriff Patricia Hendricks delivered the eulogy for Dennis, describing him as a hero twice over, first for his service in Vietnam and then for his courage in attempting to document evidence of crimes that might otherwise have remained forever hidden. Dennis Kowalski died trying to speak for victims who could no longer speak for themselves, the sheriff said. His final act was one of service to his community and to justice. Detective Santos reflected on the case's conclusion during a press conference that drew media attention from throughout the Pacific Northwest. This investigation demonstrates that justice has no statute of limitations, she said. Dennis Kowalski's courage and dedication to documenting what he found gave us the tools we needed to solve cases that had been cold for decades. His map didn't just show us where he died, it showed us the way to answers that these families desperately needed. The case became a landmark in forensic archaeology and cold case investigation, studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the country as an example of how systematic documentation could preserve evidence across decades. Dennis's mapping techniques and careful observation skills were credited with making the eventual resolution possible. Today, a memorial plaque near Proxy Falls commemorates Dennis Kowalski and the children who died in the Oregon wilderness during Carl Brennan's years of predation. The plaque, installed through donations from the families of all the victims, reads, "In memory of Dennis Kowalski, Vietnam veteran, who gave his life attempting to bring justice to the innocent. And in memory of the children whose voices he tried to preserve. Sarah Chen, age 8, Michael Torres, age 10, Jennifer Wilson, age 7, Robert Martinez, age 9, Lisa Thompson, age 6, David Anderson, age 11, Amy Foster, age 8, and Christopher Lee, age 10. Gone, but not forgotten." Margaret visits the memorial every year on September 16th, the anniversary of Dennis's final day alive. She no longer comes seeking answers. Those were finally provided by her brother's careful documentation and 35 years of patient hope. Instead, she comes to honor the memory of a brother whose final act was an attempt to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The horrifying secret that Dennis's map had pointed to was finally revealed, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers and justice for victims whose voices had been silenced, but whose stories had been preserved by one man's courage to document the truth, no matter the cost to himself.